the emotional devastation of the victims of embezzlers and insider fraud. And the few people I know who've been there as business owners describe exactly the same thing. There's this absolute loss of trust and loss of confidence in their own ability to, understand who someone is and, what they are and are not doing. Yeah.
The first time I unraveled a really big fraud, I was a baby accountant, I was barely 30.
Yeah.
And it was a farmer, and I grew up in a farm town. My dad was a farmers are men's men. They're stoic people. They'd much rather be in their trucks and out, doing deals than being in an office. And I walked in and told him, I believe that this person has taken $1.2 million from you, and I'm not done yet. And the first thing he got really quiet, and he went and just stared out his window. And when he turned around, he was crying. And I tell the story in my book, and I tell it to everybody. I said, farmers don't cry. They don't even cry at funerals. And here I am in an office with my client crying. And he's a man, and I'm trying to find Kleenex, Yeah. And I realized, and then what he said, which is to your point, he said, well, if I can't trust Tom, how in the heck do I even go home and trust my wife? What's wrong with me?
Welcome to Medical Money Matters, the podcast where you can find experts, answers, and resources so that you can achieve mastery over the financial and business aspects of your practice. Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Jill Arena. I began my career in accounting and finance, and I have more than 30 years of experience running medical groups. I own and operate a national healthcare consulting and revenue cycle company, and I am the author of Physician Healed Life Financial Self. In 2020, I co-founded the Physician Leadership Project, and my passion is to increase financial and business literacy for physicians. My guest today is Tiffany Couch. She's the founder and CEO of Acuity Forensics, a Pacific Northwest forensic accounting firm. And Tiffany has dedicated the majority of her 25-year accounting career to investigating complex cases of insider fraud and embezzling. She's a nationally recognized expert witness and an educator on the topic of fraud and forensic accounting, and her expertise has been utilized by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Public Radio, and Fraud Magazine. In addition to all of that, she's the author of the book, The Thief in Your Company, and a frequent speaker on the topic of insider fraud. And on a more personal note, Tiffany is my go-to professional whenever I hear anything sketchy from my clients. And sad to say, I referred a client to her a few months ago who's also a friend. And Tiffany, thank you for working with him. The losses from his firm are now over $1 million and still rising. So this is a really timely topic for us. And in this case, like many, I think we're going to hear about, the embezzler was someone close to him whom he trusted. Yes. So, Tiffany, yes. Welcome. I am so glad to have you here today. It's so great to have you. Yay. Well, now in your book, you say that most businesses, large and small, lose an average of 5% of their annual gross revenues to insider fraud. And that statistic that really caught my eye, kind of blew me away.
Yeah. It's a statistic from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. I would say we're well over 80,000 members worldwide, and we do robust research every 2 years. Mm-hmm. And that number is the same over and over and over again. And if you think about 5% of gross revenues, what could any company do with that, large or small?
Absolutely.
Reinvest, give dividends to owners, whatever. It's a pretty significant number, and it's a real problem out there.
It's a very large number, yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about some common ways in which you see medical practices getting embezzled.
Sure. So, I say fraud is the second oldest profession in the world. If there's money, there's money to steal.
Yeah.
And doctors and dentists and folks like that are no different. Number one, it is the skimming of copays that are coming across the desk. How many of those patients are paying cash or even not cash? I've seen the skimming of checks, and I've seen the skimming of credit cards. And skimming means the person steals the money that's on the way into the practice before it has the ability to be deposited to the bank. So that's more common actually in medical and dental practices than I would say in other businesses. The most common way fraud occurs, and it occurs this way, big or small client, is the person simply writes checks to themselves. And when I say write checks, I use that term loosely, but they're effectively using money that's already in the bank and transferring it to themselves. They're doing that by writing a check to themselves. They're doing that by overpaying themselves payroll. They're doing that by misusing the debit or credit card. And they're doing that, sometimes they try to get a little sneaky and they will set up a fake business and write checks to the business. We call that a shell company scheme. And they write checks to that. And they do this because they know nobody's looking at the bank statements every month.
Yep.
And you would be shocked by how long these kinds of schemes go on without any detection whatsoever.
Well, one of the statistics we found in doing research about this topic is the MGMA study that showed the majority of the schemes last for 5 years or longer, which means it's not a 1 or a 2 time occurrence. This is ongoing, people taking money out of medical practices, kind of right out from under the nose of the owner.
Correct. And if you were to put those frauds on a sliding scale or on a graph, you would see them start off small and maybe even be somewhat haphazard. And then as the person doesn't get caught, it just grows and grows and grows, and usually even to their own surprise. That it's almost like using that credit card at Christmas and getting the bill in January and going, I didn't know I spent that much money.
How did it get this large? Yeah.
Exactly.
And do you find, while they're getting more brazen, do you find that they get more sophisticated too, or is it just they're taking more money by the same means?
Oh, great question. The sophistication usually comes in with how they're hiding it. And what I will often learn from my clients is that there will be behavioral changes where the person starts to, not go on vacation or, not want to train other people, or they sort of get offended when my clients ask them for basic documentation. Yeah. And so what the sophistication, in my personal opinion, is pretty unsophisticated most of the time. It doesn't have to be. But what does change is usually the behaviors.
Interesting. So those are great tips for our listeners to be looking for, are just those behavioral changes. And it struck me also in thinking about this that the most sophisticated embezzlers we probably never know about. Those that go under the radar. Yeah.
They really do. I would say the most sophisticated embezzler, I never met him, but I investigated what he did. It was a medical practice, and he was taking the money. He was basically effectively transferring money to himself, and that's simple. So I know where to look. I know, there's only a few ways people can steal. The sophistication comes in as to how the person's going to hide it, because you have to reconcile the bank, or hopefully you're reconciling the bank, or you're having to make everything tick and tie out.
Yeah.
And what he was doing was what I call shotgunning the amounts through the ledger, but the majority of it looked like it was going to the doctor's pension. Oh. And when you looked at pension expense, it didn't seem all that crazy for a medical practice. But nobody ever reconciled the pension reports to the pension expense ledger account on the accounting system. And had they done that, they would have realized, well, we have all these expenses to pension, but they never landed in the pension account.
Got
And
it.
that's because he was transferring it to himself. But the sophistication came in, at least in my mind, that he came to work every day. He was your, and I can say this because I am one, he was your stereotypical accountant, kind of drab, kind of nerdy, kind of quiet. Everybody said he drove sort of an old sob into work every day, kind of wore the same clothes, had what they called a basic apartment somewhere in Portland, and unbeknownst to everybody, he'd still stolen millions, about $5 million from my client.
Yeah.
He had a beautiful condo in Arizona. He had a beautiful condo at the beach. He had lots of art, beautiful cars, expensive cars, but he never leaked any of that lifestyle out, and nobody at work would have ever guessed it. And that's usually the number one thing that all of my clients will tell me is that lifestyle leaks out. Somebody's driving a new car, or never wearing the same outfit twice, or, some expenditures no longer make sense for what my clients know they're paying this person, or what people generally know about the couple, if there is a couple. And so in my mind, in my professional experience, the sophistication was his ability to just totally lay low for that many years, 5-6 years. And it was only caught because they got a new controller, and things did not make sense. They did not have the cash flow she thought that they should. She in fact called the bank multiple times, and the bank was like, no, there's no money going out anywhere it's not supposed to. And I can't remember exactly how she figured it out, but she glommed onto it and unraveled it all.
Wow. Well, good for them that she did take a look at that. So is that the largest amount of money that you've seen taken?
5 million. It's up there. I would say most schemes in a small to medium sized business is usually $1 million or less. But 5 million is up there, although I'm working a case right now where we're in the hundreds of millions.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
that's going to be a big one. But that is so rare. I would say, $1 million, the average in my practice, and really if you look at the statistics as well, it's 6 figures or more by the time it's found. So usually you're at least 100,000 or more by the time it's found. But it's not uncommon for me to see those numbers rise into, the millions.
Yeah. It's it always makes me shake my head just thinking about. Yeah. And frequently, people describe the embezzler just the way you did. So is there a profile of the stereotypical embezzler?
There is. There really is. And this pattern comes from my spending the last 17 years doing nothing but this, but also just if you read any article or look at some of the statistics, you're going to find the same thing. So the first thing, and it's really what my book is about, is that these people use their ability to be liked and to be trusted to perpetrate their crimes. And if you think about it, if somebody didn't like you or me, they wouldn't give us access to their bank accounts or their money. Never. And certainly if they could not be forward facing with the patients or the clientele of the business, they would also probably not be somebody who would be given that kind of access. So in our minds, when we think about the bad guys, we sort of draw pictures in our head of what we've been programmed our whole lives to see, the good guy versus the bad guy on the movies or the television screen. And in fact, it's the opposite. So that's number one. It's always the most trusted person in my client's business. And if they're not the most trusted, they're in the top 3. It always. And that's the most sinister part. So that's number one. Number 2, we often see that they are the first one to work and the last one to leave. I had a physician here in town and in Vancouver where he would drive by his clinic sometimes on his way home from his kid's soccer practice or a late night event, and the lights would be on and he'd be like, oh my gosh, Sally, we'll call her Sally. Sally was wonderful. She worked, late into the night. Well, that's when Sally was cooking the books, quite literally, to
Wow.
change things. So they often work, first one to work, last one to leave. They will often not take vacation, or if they're taking vacations, they often don't make sense in terms of how lavish they might be.
Mm.
And number four, their lifestyle doesn't make sense. So, a great example is a client I had where everybody knew, my client obviously knew, she made $15 an hour. Now, this was many years ago, but still, she made $15 an hour, had two kids at home, two teenage boys at home, and was driving a brand new Audi. The kids had snow skis, jet skis. They went on these lavish vacations. Things didn't make sense. So the lifestyle doesn't make sense. And then another big one is that they are easily offended. My clients will describe to me that they are walking on eggshells because they will ask for what they think are basic questions, and the person won't be necessarily willing to give it to them.
Yeah.
And then I think lastly, they are often wrapped around the pinky finger of the owners or the management. They don't always get along with the coworkers.
Oh.
And what you find is that the coworkers are all sitting back here going, oh, he really likes her, or she really likes her, and meaning my boss really likes her, and I know things aren't quite right, but my boss is never going to believe me. So we often see where the bosses or the owners really think wonderful things about this person, and in hindsight, you'll find that they're not necessarily team players at work.
Yeah, got it. That is a great descriptor, and your word sinister in the middle there is completely apt. Because I can just envision now, likely all of our listeners are starting to think, who do I trust the most? And then should I really be trusting that person? And that's, that's a challenging place to be. And you describe in your book.
And what I realized from that day forward, every client from that day forward said the same thing. What's wrong with me? Because if you've ever been betrayed in your life by somebody you love dearly, a friend or whomever, we all know that is pain like no other.
Yeah.
And when you bring that into an office situation, it is devastating, because what's wrong with me that I trusted this person? What's wrong with me that I can't run my business well?
Yeah.
What's wrong with me that I've lost this money or I didn't see it? It's sinister and awful. And it's because if you think about it, these people are using their ability to be liked and to be trusted to do this. And when I have to continue to tell my clients, they use their ability to like and to be liked and trusted to do this to you.
Yeah.
It's awful.
It is, and you use the right word in there. Betrayal is absolutely how I've had it described to me, and it's a crime, and it's a theft, and it is a betrayal, and
It is.
probably the bigger theft aside from the money is just hijacking that person's confidence in their ability to trust and to have relationships, and how devastating that can really be. So what advice would you give to our listeners if in fact they find that someone in their company has committed insider fraud? What would you say to them right now?
So I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And number one, I'm sorry. Number two, we can figure this out. And number three, you will get through this.
Yeah.
And I will always tell my clients, give this to me. You go back to doing what you do well. You go back to being a doctor. Give this to me. Let me help you figure it out. And let me help you figure out how not to have this happen again.
Yeah.
And that's what I say over and over. Like you said, you sadly have to refer clients to me, and I get it.
Yeah.
When I answer the phone here, I'm saying, I'm so sorry that you had to call me. And we usually have a counseling session for the first hour. So I let them get all their emotions out.
Yeah.
And by them getting their emotions out, they're telling me things that are giving me clues to, of where to look or what to figure out or who to go and talk to. So I let them, sort of have that counseling session on purpose so that I can do my job a little bit better, because it gives me Yeah.
It just struck me as you were talking that you're kind of part therapist. That's probably the first part, and then you get to be a forensic accountant after that. But
Correct.
absolutely,
Correct.
well, and it's interesting those little things that we sort of almost know, kind of those things that niggle in the background for us, and that might have us suspecting things. What should our listeners do if they suspect someone in their organization might be embezzling?
Sure. So the first thing to do is to not ignore what you're describing as intuition. We all have intuition, all right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's something in the back of our mind. Sometimes it's a stomach ache, but whatever it is, it's a real thing. And what I will find is my clients will override their minds will override that intuition. I don't, Jill's a really nice person. I don't want to hurt her feelings.
Yeah.
Right? So they will think that something's wrong with them for thinking badly. So my first recommendation is do not dismiss your intuition. It's there for you and it's working on your behalf. Number two, there are ways to actually look into some things without the person even knowing, for the most part. And that there are ways for you to get a comfort level without maybe having a personal interaction right off the bat or even accusing anybody. So that's number two. Understand that, yes, even though if that person has all the control, there are ways to get around it so we can figure it out. And then number three, I would just figure out a few things. So a great example is a client, the same physician I was talking about. When he called me, he had caught his beloved office manager, like 14 years with him, overpaying payroll.
Okay.
And he called me in and he said, Tiffany, I heard you speak. I thought I was the exception to the rule. I just didn't believe it could ever be her because I loved her. She loved me, and not in an inappropriate way, but
Sure.
in a true,
Like
I
a
love this
friendship.
person that works for me,
Yeah.
And so, anyway, he caught her doing this, overpaying herself payroll. When he asked her about it, she left for lunch and didn't come back. And all he wanted me to do, just like your friend actually is very common, all he wanted me to do is look at the payroll and figure it out.
Yeah.
But I asked him a question, and I want your listeners to ask themselves this question. How's business? How's business? Because what he told me was this. Business is great. I'm seeing more patients than I have time for. I'm not playing golf on Fridays anymore. I'm thinking of hiring not only another physician, but another assistant. Like he knew business was better.
Yeah.
And he said, but it's just weird. I'm not taking as much money home.
Yep.
And he said, but I don't know why you're asking me this, Tiffany. You just need to get over there and figure out the payroll. So I want your listeners to ask themselves that, because that might also bring up some of that intuition.
Yeah.
The biggest thing, the most common way fraud occurs is somebody simply using your money to inappropriately benefit themselves. And they do that by transferring money out of a bank account, out of payroll, or out of a credit card account.
Yep.
And all of those three things come with reports. A bank statement, a credit card statement, and a payroll report.
Yep.
And you can easily pull those yourself or have a outside accountant pull that. Sometimes a spouse, whomever. Pull your bank accounts, cancel checks every month, and just look at what's literally going through your accounts. And are those things approved?
Yeah.
You will find the majority of fraud by doing that simple task. Not only one time, but every month. And then it's a little harder in a professional practice, but it's definitely important. Most have a day sheet at the end of the day. We know how much money we brought in over the counter through the mail. We know, what collections look like. We know what billings looked like. And I always ask, do those day sheets, what says what we collected, does that match tomorrow's deposit on the bank statement?
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, you potentially need to look into it. Especially when you look at the cash and check sections of the day sheet, that should match tomorrow's deposit.
Yep. That's a great piece of advice. With our revenue cycle team, when we're acting as the outsourced billing department for our
Yep.
clients, part of our traditional onboarding is setting up that internal control where we're doing a reconciliation, as you say, between what went into the practice management system, what's on the day sheet, versus the bank deposit. And we also add in versus what got posted into your accounting system, whether it's QuickBooks or Sage or another. And I frequently have to talk quite a bit with physician owners and boards to get them to understand why we would want to do that kind of reconciliation, just as you said earlier, to tick and tie, to make sure everything adds up every day. And
Correct.
occasionally, every day, yeah. Occasionally, we might have a little timing difference here and there, if the deposit hit a banking holiday or whatever. But
That's going to happen.
yeah, yeah,
Somebody miscounted something or the bank miscounted something.
yeah,
But those should be infrequent and, easily explainable.
yeah, yeah,
But if you're seeing consistent issues, it bears figuring out why.
yeah,
Ideally, you want the people who are posting payments to be separate from the person billing and or taking money to the bank. I understand some practices are too small to have that happen,
yeah,
but we definitely want to keep those people separate. And then on occasion, at least monthly, quarterly at the max, you really should be looking at any of your write-offs, because one of the things that I often see is that the person's able to get the day sheets and everything to reconcile, but when I start pulling the not just contractual write-offs, but sort of a professional discount kind of rate, my physician owners will say, I didn't give that patient that discount that day. And I will often see that as a way of that person skimming the money coming across the desk, but making everything reconcile on the back end. And so looking at those write-off reports on at least a monthly basis, I think would be important too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I want to call out for our listeners what Tiffany and I are talking about are what's known in the industry and sort of accounting speak as internal controls. And when I talk with physicians about internal controls, usually I get a lot of blank stares because we don't do any business training in medical school. And so internal controls don't necessarily have to be terribly complex or sophisticated, but just the fact that physicians have them in place and that's commonly known around the practice can do a lot to deter a potential fraudster. So what are some of your other favorite internal controls? I like that reconciliation to the day sheet. I like that separation or segregation of duties between people who are posting and doing bank deposits as much as you can. And then owner review is great too, even if they're just scanning voided checks or whatever. Yeah.
Well, I love the your description there, the deterrence. If anybody out there's ever been a parent, they all know that their children, especially when they're little, they get in trouble the most when mom and dad aren't looking, right? When that toddler gets quiet, you know that there is trouble brewing.
Yeah.
And it's as if they know we're busy making dinner. They know we're on the phone, right?
Yeah.
They know when we're distracted, and that's when trouble happens. I just say, grown-ups are just children in adults' bodies. And so when they know what you're looking at and they know what you're not looking at. So even the appearance of you looking and asking questions is a huge deterrent. It's a great internal control. It doesn't have to be complicated or cost you a lot of money, but just literally getting the bank statements and canceled check images, credit card statements, and your payroll reports, and having them be put on your desk every month, and you asking questions about them, even if you know the answer. What's this payment to Acuity Forensics? What's this payment to Jill Arena? Right? Now your bookkeepers and the other people at the front know that you're paying attention.
Yeah.
Huge deterrent.
Yeah.
Here's the other reason why I ask you to pull those, and I literally am asking you to get them in paper. I realize it's not green, but if you've ever been on online banking, number one, you got to sit down and figure out your code and get in there, and then just trying to open all your transactions, it takes a while. All right, it just takes time that none of us have. But if you have a stack of, if you have a bank statement and you're just going through it, it probably will take you 10 minutes or less for most practices to scan your deposits. Does this make sense for our collections this month? Scan your withdrawals. Are there any ATM or other debit transactions that you did not approve? And then scan your canceled check images and make sure they're written only to vendors or to individuals who you know. A number one way fraud occurs, and it's the easiest and most effective internal control. You do the same thing with your credit card statements and your payroll reports, and you're going to catch probably 75 to 80% of most frauds are in those three categories. And then if you can up your game to looking at your deposits or even asking those questions about your write-offs or your collections, you're covering most.
I love that. I love that advice. Yeah, that's
and
fantastic.
It's I know I'm asking you to do more, and if you don't have the time, your spouse might have the time. If you don't have the time, there might be a non-accountant in the office who has the time, right? We want to make sure that the person who has access to the money is not the person obviously doing these double checks.
Yeah.
So as long as it's a totally separate person and you're doing those checks and just asking random questions of your staff, you're gonna be doing better than almost every single client I've ever had.
Yeah, that is fantastic. Well, my experience with physicians is many are conflict averse. So I really appreciate your advice about ways in which you can check if you think there's an embezzler in your practice, and also systems you can put in place that are not high conflict by any stretch, but just the fact that the physician owner or the finance committee is requesting printed copies of all of the documents you just listed, will put everyone on notice that, there's a degree of scrutiny here. There are responsible owners. They have good oversight. It's almost like when you have a burglar alarm on your house, planting the sign out in front is a huge deterrent. The thieves will say, oh, and you may not set the alarm every day or every night. You may not review those reports every month when they land on your desk, but the fact that you've requested them and they see, you want to make sure you do review them periodically, but when they see that you're at least engaged in that, I think that can be a huge deterrent.
And some of my medical clients or doctors and dentists will have like a practice manager. But what I find sometimes is the practice manager still has control of all the bank accounts and that sort of thing. And they're not truly a separate, segregated person. So if that's the case, you probably even have to elevate that review up above your practice manager level as well. Now, if your practice manager level doesn't have accounting access or is not doing not collecting money and doesn't have access to the bank, then potentially it's right for them to do that review. It just depends on how what that practice manager's role really is.
Yeah, and in my old days as an auditor, I came out with something helpful in terms of putting in internal controls and how to talk about it with your team. And that is, as a responsible employer, you want to have systems in place so that none of your employees is ever in a position where they could be suspected of embezzling. Like, you've handled that as a business owner, and you've made certain that there are good safeguards in place so that no one ever gets into that really uncomfortable position of the owner starting to question, and kind of looking.
It's a great thing because a lot of times when people will call, I think there's something wrong. I don't want to upset this person who's working for me. My question always is, and in fact, I'm going to a client this week where the question I have is, do I have an ego problem or a fraud problem or both. And what we want to do is, it doesn't matter if you love Jill and Jill's that person in your office. We want to put internal controls around everybody, no matter who's sitting there, because we not only want to keep your practice's money safe, we want to keep employees safe in their job. And when you explain it that way, people will. And I had a woman, it was in the Tri-Cities. It was a new doctor that was buying into a practice that had been established for probably more than 30 years. So there was sort of the old guard, and this guy was the new guard, and he and his wife wanted information for the buy-in and just to understand. And they had one woman who had worked there 30 years who absolutely hated having anybody ask her questions or give her anything. And I mean, we had every red flag. And I combed through those books, and everything ticked and tied out. And when it ticked and tied out, the new doctor asked me to go further back. And it really caused problems, between the doctors. And when the woman, she ended up, there was no fraud. But at some point, she needed my W-9 so she could pay my bill. And she called here and asked, I happened to answer the phone, and she said, well, how, I just can't believe they would ever question me after all the loyalty. I've been so loyal, 30 years. And I said, if $5 goes missing, all roads point to you. And she got quiet, and she said, I never thought of it that way. And I said, you're not safe in your job. Because I said, it's wonderful to have control, and it's wonderful to be needed, but you're not, all roads point to you. And so she, evidently after that, I heard that she started, giving more things to other people to get herself out of that position. And I often find when I explain it that way, the innocent person will do exactly that. They will sit back in their chair and go, oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way. And they will be more apt to participate in internal controls, where a guilty person or a person stealing will sort of dig in and say, no way, and you know what, am I going to ever share anything? This is my job. This is my desk. Nobody touch it.
Nobody touches it. Well,
that's a great way to sort of introduce the idea and kind of gauge where your staff are, what they're saying.
Well, a darker side of that similar story, we worked with a group of surgeons here in Portland whose controller left abruptly, and she had master admin rights in their accounting system. And she took the accounting system with her, never gave it back. They had to rebuild data for quite some time. And also they had no way of really ascertaining how much fraud had gone on. They could only guess. And so that's one big thing I say to clients that I put in my book is make certain that one of the owners of the business always has master admin rights, whether it's, again, QuickBooks or whatever accounting system you might be using.
QuickBooks, the medical practice system, the front desk keys.
All of it,
everything should not be in the hands of an employee. They really should be in the hands of the owners.
Absolutely. Well, we are just coming up on time. What a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much. And I wanted to close out by asking you for one top piece of advice that you have for our listeners.
My biggest top piece of advice is that you're smarter than you believe in terms of your money. So many folks, whether they're doctors or lawyers or plumbers or whomever, they believe they're really good at their practice, and they don't have a lot of confidence around their money. And so they often abdicate that responsibility to somebody else out of fear that they're going to screw it up themselves, or they don't understand it, or whatever. And all I want you to know is that you are smarter than you believe. And the more control you take and the more knowledge you have about your money, both in your practice and personally, the better off and more confident you're going to be. It's just like being a doctor. You weren't a doctor right away. It took a long time to get to where you're sitting. And it's just going to take some time to get your head around how to understand how the money comes in, how it flows out, how it gets to you. And there are people like Jill, like me, there are lots of us who would be delighted to help give you more confidence. So don't abdicate your financial life to anybody. Take control back.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great
You're
advice. And what a fabulous conversation. We are going to put all of Tiffany's contact information, her website, as well as the link to her book, The Thief in Your Company, which is available on Amazon. We will put all of those links in the show notes for today. And Tiffany, my thanks again. What a great conversation.
Great conversation.
All
Great
right.
job.
Thanks. You can find more information online at medicalmoneymatterspodcast.com, and you can subscribe to the Medical Money Matters content website for physician leaders to find budget templates and many other tools. We've included those links in the show notes. As I like to close out these podcasts, congratulations on taking the next step in your professional development and for making the commitment to learn about the financial and business aspects of your practice. I look forward to being on this journey with you and send you my heartfelt gratitude for all that you do for your patients all day, every day.